So the techniques we use within a permaculture orchard to try to recreate some of that functional complexity of how a forest ecosystem works and to get the benefits of those interactions into our system and make that system more resilient and productive over time is looking at the relative roles of the different plants in that system and making sure that we're having things like nutrient accumulators and nitrogen fixators and in support of our main productive species, and as much as possible trying to create some layered complexity in that system to help shade weeds and avoid weed competition, increase productivity by having more surface area available for photosynthesis, and better kind of replicating the patterning of a natural forest system. So when we look at a forest system, there's different layers, and we call that stratification. So stratification is a term referring to different layers of a ecosystem. So the layers of a forest is the canopy trees and the sub-canopy trees, and you've got shrubs often in that system. You've got ground cover. There's vines often trellised up the bigger trees. In a forest we often get epiphytes, which are plants that live up in the crown of trees, up in the branches. And you can have mushrooms that are also beneficial layer in that canopy. So what you're getting there is different productive layers in the system. So I'll just shade them in a few different colours to help them stand out. So here's the sub-canopy and the shrubs. And here's the green. And some ground cover. And vines. Mushrooms. And these epiphytes as well. So with the recognition of that pattern, it then comes down to how can we best replicate that pattern excuse me, within an agriculturally productive system in a way that's of most advantage to us. So we've got to look at, out of these layers here, which ones can we substitute for agriculturally productive species. So for our canopy trees, for example, we might have big nitrogen fixating trees, and they could be acting as a trellis for vines, and while the nitrogen fixating trees are not providing us with food, they are improving the habitat to this environment, so they could be providing shelter, and that could be particularly important for protecting the emergence of other trees. So that shelter could be important protection for other trees. They also tend to grow faster because they're getting that supply of nitrogen from their root nodules. So these nitrogen fixating trees have got a relationship with nitrogen fixating bacteria that can take atmospheric carbon and sequester, fix it. So they're nitrogen fixating, so they fix it into nitrates, and they can release those nitrates into the soil. So they grow faster. They improve the soil conditions, and they can act as a nice trellis for productive vines. So you can trellis grapes and kiwi fruit and banana passion fruit up them. They act as a nice structure for that, so act as a good trellis. For vines. And I often think in New Zealand we have quite a dominance of grapes and kiwi fruit and even banana passion fruit to some degree. We could use these nitrogen fixating trees as a way to trellis those vines in a productive system, but also beneficially change the environment that will help increase the productivity of those vines, instead of just growing those vines on a wooden or a metal trellis and create in a quite a sterile, toxic environment that's maintained by a lot of sprays and chemicals and mowing and other things. We can use these natural structures that will benefit the habitats and also provide a natural trellising. So they can be of great benefit, particularly in establishing a system. So going into that early stage of productivity where you want to change often the environment in which these young productive trees are growing in a way that will benefit those young growing trees. A nitrogen fixating tree will grow faster, give them some shelter and support and help improve these conditions in the soil in a way that will benefit the more productive species that you're interested in. And then as the more productive species increase in maturity and start to get a foothold in the soil and be able to improve the soil conditions by themselves, you then might want to severely prune back these nitrogen fixating trees, so you can prune them and mulch those prunings, and they act as a nice sustainable source of mulch for the system. Mulch and add to soil. So instead of having to buy mulches to protect the soil, keep out weeds, and feed the fungi in the soil, which will help your productive plants, because it's the fungi that will break down the woody matter and release the nutrients in it to the other plants in that system. So by placing these nitrogen fixating trees in the system, you're placing a continually renewable resource of nitrogen and mulch and beneficial interactions in the soil by pruning it back and mulching it. Because every time you prune it back, you're also going to kill off the root zone, and root zone have got all these nitrogen fixating nodules in them, so you're not only adding the organic matter of the roots, but you're adding all these nitrates that we're feeding off those roots. They'll die off and release those nitrates into the soil, which will be food for the other plants in that guild there. So these are some of the benefits of a nitrogen fixating tree. Some of these ground covers can be quite useful too. You can incorporate dynamic nutrient accumulators that can send down big tap roots and not only help, so these are ground cover, and you can incorporate dynamic accumulators in there, which will bring up nutrients from the soil and shade out and outcompete weeds. So some of these ground covers, these dynamic accumulators, could be considered weeds themselves, so things like comfrey and dandelion and dock and all these kind of quite invasive plants. They've all adapted to live in quite marginal soil conditions and have evolved traits to survive in those conditions more effectively than more kind of forest edge or forest species, which have adapted to they've adapted to better conditions where they're supported by the beneficial interactions of other species, rather than these weed species that are kind of exposed to the elements and poor soils, and they've got to have quite resilient traits to survive in those conditions. But you can make use of their functions. So as you're establishing an orchard system, and you're often establishing it in a system which is quite marginal soil and exposed to the elements and you want to improve the soil and help feed your productive crops, you can make use of the traits of these ground covers to bring up the nutrients with their big tap roots, and you can mow them over, or you can get other animals to graze them and return the nutrients that they've been collecting back into the soil again. So these can be mowed or grazed and return the nutrients they've collected back into the soil. And when you do that, you're improving the soil conditions in a way that will better support the growth of these productive species and less support the growth of these weeds, because these weeds are really favoured by poor soil conditions, and the better the soil conditions become, the less favourable that soil condition is for these weeds. So if you make the soil better, you improve the rates of growth of the productive plants and you decrease the rate of growth of the weeds. So you can mow or graze and return nutrients to soil and improve growth of productive plants. But also by just being in place, while they're growing themselves, they're out competing other less useful weeds that could be quite invasive in the system and less easy to mow or graze and control that way. So they're also providing a function of outshading and competing weeds and just helping the management of the system. So mushrooms, they'll be naturally there as a consequence of creating a system which has got these different plants in it that are feeding the fungi with lipids and proteins that only the fungi can break down. But also as you mulch them and so if you mulch nitrogen fixating trees or add mulch to the system by mowing grass or through manures of animals or from chopping and mulching branches, you're also producing food for these fungi, so they're going to naturally occur in the system, and you can make deliberate use of this by selecting species that have a commercial harvest. So you might take shiitake or field mushrooms and inoculate the soils around these plants with the spores of these mushrooms, so that the mushrooms that turn up, you'll get a variety of things, but some of them will be the productive ones that you want, and you can get a yield off those productive ones as a economic supplement of the system, or for your own consumption. So incorporating mushrooms can be quite beneficial, and it's not something that many growers do, so it can give you a competitive advantage over others. So if you're in the marketplace and you've got the diversity of your tree crops and you've also got mushrooms, it just gives you another item to sell, an item that's improving the health of your system, and an item you can eat as well. So it has three good positive benefits which you should always look for in a element that you incorporate into a permaculture design. Okay, so we've got some ground cover. They might not only be these nitrogen accumulators, but they may be things like berries or herbs that have medicinal values, such as the herbs, or you can dry them, you can sell them. There's quite good markets for dried herbs, or creating herb products. We've got a herb farm here in Manawatu, so they specialise in creating cosmetic kind of products from various extracts of herbs, so that's something you could look into, or even creating teas or other kind of health products from that. And the berries, obviously, you can consume, or you can dry, or you can freeze and have another product there that you can sell. But they'll also, help fit into the system, cover the grounds, create a living mulch in that, and at the same time as outcompeting weeds and creating a living mulch, they're also sending out exudates into the soil to attract beneficial soil communities in here that will benefit the other plants in the system. So just like in a normal forest, you're getting all these beneficial interactions in the soil micro community. between these different plants, you can replicate that by having this functional diversity within your permaculture system. And then shrubs, again, you can have berries. There's also quite a few nitrogen fixating shrubs that you can incorporate in there, and again you can prune them back and mulch them as a way to improve the soil condition, but they can also be nice nursery plants to help establish the main crop species, or they can be a productive plant with berries and things that you can have a commercial harvest from. And then you've got your subcanopy tree. So this tends to be the one you're most interested in. This is your main crop normally. So that could be your apples, or your pears, or your I was thinking of feijoas, but that's probably more of a shrub. That would be a good one for the shrub layer feijoas. But or it depends on your climate. You can have mangoes, you can have figs, you can have various nut trees. You can have hazelnuts that are kind of intermediate between these two layers here. But generally in this layer here, it's going to be at kind of eye height level. It's a subcanopy tree, so it can be grown on a dwarf rootstock to keep it nice and small. But it's going to be the layer that's most convenient to harvest, and it's going to be the one that you're most likely to focus in, and these other ones are going to kind of tie in support of this main production species. Or it could be this big canopy tree. It could be a big nut tree, for example, or it could be a big cider apple tree, and it might be your main productive species as well. But these big canopy trees are obviously a lot bigger, so they can be harder to harvest. So if it's commercial harvest you're interested in, you'll probably prune it back or graft it onto a dwarfing rootstock to keep it at a smaller size, unless it's a big nut tree, to make it more easily harvestable. So you're trying to position your productive species with a supportive guild of plants. So you're positioning your productive species with a supportive guild of plants. And with each of these support species, or alternatively productive species, you're trying to look for 3 beneficial traits of each species that you incorporate. So obviously the obvious one is normally improving the soil conditions, because they all kind of have co-evolved and co-evolved into forest edge or forest ecosystems, so they are used to working together with other similar compatible plants, and they prefer the environment from those mutual beneficial interactions. So just incorporating other forest plants into it is going to improve the soil ecosystem and soil conditions, which will support your productive plant. But they could also have other productive things like fixing nitrogen or mining nutrients, and being able to manage their growth to return their surplus growth back into the system to support your main species. So you're kind of pruning them back, or you're grazing them with grazers, or you're mowing them in a way to kind of favour the system's productivity towards your main production, rather than all the energy going into the canopy tree or the shrub layer. So you're trying to redirect that energy into your production system. And by doing that, you're creating this ongoing supply of mulch and ground covers and or other productive species. You know, it could be a supplementary harvest of berries or mushrooms, or it could be this vine producing kiwi fruit or grapes, or it could be, you know, it's quite diverse production. But generally speaking, if it's going to be commercially viable, you don't want it to be too complex, Generally you've got one or two, maybe three productive species, and the other are in support of that, and you're managing those other ones quite intensively by grazing or pruning and redirecting the nutrients that they've accumulated back into the soil to support the growth of your main crop. So they're really there just to support your main crop. But you can get two or three productive species in there and then diversify your income and diversify your yields within that system in a way that doesn't get too complicated, so that harvesting doesn't get too hard.